بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله الحمد لله حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيده وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا كريم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. رب زدني علما رب زدني علما رب زدني علما. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. Welcome everyone to the series on the Seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are approaching, insha'Allah ta'ala, the blessed month of Ramadan, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And for that, for this year, we've decided that we will be studying the Seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the previous Ramadans, I'd been teaching some of the surah of the Quran, tafsir of the Quran. And in 2013, I believe, I also did a series of lessons on the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Those lessons were a little bit different in that I took certain portraits from the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and focused all of the time on those specific lessons. This particular series, however, is such that we will be going through the complete life of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is you can call this a brief account of the life of the Prophet ﷺ for the purposes of this account. I will be looking at a number of different sources to study the Seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to record the account of the Seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one of the primary sources that I'll be relying upon in this journey is, insha'Allah, a book by the famous author by the name of Abu al-Hasan Ali al-Nadawi, who wrote a book entitled As-Seerah al-Nabawiyyah, just like that, okay? And of course, there's another very important book that I'll be going back to, and that is Fiqh al-Seerah by Muḥammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Buti. And in addition to these two, I will go back to the source works, which on top of all of them happens to be Seerah ibn Hisham itself, who recorded Ibn Ishaq's commentaries on the Seerah. And Ibn Ishaq is, of course, the most authoritative biographer of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the history of Islam. So these are some of the sources that I'll be looking at. As I said, within 20 days, going over an entire lifetime that was filled with, a lot of different events that took place is a very challenging thing to do. So I hope Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the tawfiq to get through this, to learn as best as we can from this, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And I ask you all, insha'Allah, to make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just as He's given us the opportunity to begin, He also gives us the opportunity to continue right till the end, and most importantly, to benefit from this life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For myself personally, the way I became introduced to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was through the parents, of course, right? My mother, as a child, she would take storybooks of the Seerah and she would read it to us, all of the siblings. And then when I got to my teenage, I read the very first time, I read a complete, extensive biography of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. By the end of the biography, I felt so moved and so touched that I believe that reading that biography of the Messenger was perhaps one of the most important and key turning points in my life, and one of the most important and key points as a whole within my personal life, right? This is what the Seerah means to me. Thereafter, alhamdulillah, I read many books on the Seerah. I've also written small works on different aspects of the Seerah, such as the mu'jizat of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the miracles of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. And I hope that insha'Allah ta'ala you feel just as touched, if not more, than I felt at that point. And I hope all of us, insha'Allah, feel touched by the life of the man who touched all of humanity altogether within this journey, insha'Allah. Before we get into the journey, however, today I want to talk about two things, okay? Two very important things without which we will not be able to understand why this man, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was sent, and who this man actually was, and what he meant to humanity as a whole. Because remember, as opposed to other messengers, the Prophet ﷺ, Muhammad, his message was general to all of humanity. Okay? The Prophet told us of this in a hadith that كان النبي يبعث إلى قومه خاصة وبعثت إلى الناس عامة. A prophet used to be sent to his people particularly. As for me, I was sent to humanity all together. Okay? So we know that there's a very, very clear difference between the call of the messenger Muhammad and all of the other prophets. So why is there that difference? That's the big question. To understand this, I'm going to look today, inshallah, at two different things. The first thing is the religions which were there prior to the prophethood of Muhammad, rather prior to the birth of Muhammad. So the Prophet ﷺ is born in 570, right? Common era. That means that the Prophet ﷺ was born in the 6th century. In this time, we noticed that around the world there are 5 or 6 key religions that are pretty much followed by the masses of the world. Today, if we look at the religions, we know that 3 religions are the religions which are followed by the masses of the world. In addition to that, there are other religions as well. 3 key religions account for the largest majority of the world, right? Similarly, there was about 5 odd religions that accounted for the majority of the world. One of them being Judaism, okay? And I say Judaism because it's one of the earlier ones. However, the problem with Judaism during that time was, and it continues to be, was that Judaism became devoid of spirituality to some degree, okay? Spirituality decreased within them, and that's because they did sometimes, at some points in history, they actually corrupted the religion in many different ways. Now, how that corruption occurred and what happened and the different stages that it went through, that's a different subject altogether. But it's enough for us to know that corruption had occurred within the Torah, right? This is something that we know even through the Quran. So now all we had left of Judaism was basic rites and rituals, RITS, rituals of worship. And in addition to that, it became a religion which discriminated between races, okay? So it became a bit of a racist religion in that way. Whereas if you happen to be from the Israelites, then you are saved. If you don't happen to be from the Israelites, then there's a question mark around you no matter what you do, okay? So that sort of racism led to another problem, and that was that people were not really interested in this creed, okay? So this was one of the key religions at that time. And in addition to this, Judaism slowly started to adopt different aspects of polytheism through their interactions over centuries with different people and people of different religion. This is something that, last point that I'm making, is something that even Jewish historians admit to, okay? They will mention that it is true that in some way, shape or another, Judaism had become affected by, it was affected by the neighboring religions, which a lot of which happen to be polytheist, pagan religions, right? So pagan religions. That's the first one. Then we have Christianity. Christianity went through 3 major problems over the 5 or 6 centuries that it existed prior to Islam, right? The first problem that it went through was distortions as well, like the previous one, okay? The second problem that it went through was misunderstandings, okay? Misunderstandings. Scholarship within Judaism was a lot more than it was within Christianity, especially within the earlier times. Number 2, the information that the Jews had access to was perhaps a little bit more because of how many prophets had come to them than the information that the Christians had access to. So misunderstandings began to arise within Christianity. And the third thing that happened is that polytheism, just like the previous one, it also started to occur within this religion as well. So we had a lot of these problems that I've described here. In addition to that, around the 4th century, after the assumed death of Christ, we don't believe that he died, but after the assumed death of Christ, meaning the common era, Christianity as a monotheist creed had failed. Why? Because the creed of Trinity was introduced into Christianity now, right? So now you had people believing that there is the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Okay, so you had a major creedal problem, you had a major theological problem within this religion by this time. And in addition to that, we also find that in the 6th century itself, the same century within which the Prophet ﷺ was born, we find that there was wars taking place between the Christians of the Levant and the Christians of Egypt. Okay? Over what? Over how we should understand the existence of Jesus. What exactly is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Should we consider him God, not God? And all the other different questions that they'd already dealt with in the 4th century. Okay, 200 years later, they're still arguing and debating. And of course, we know that there were still some sects of the Christians which remained true to the Christianity that Isa alayhi salam had brought. We have this in a hadith. The Prophet ﷺ told us that Allah Azza wa Jal looked at the creation, إِنَّ اللَّهَ نَظَرَ إِلَى الْخَلْقِ, and He despised all of them. فَمَقَتَهُمْ عَرَبَهُمْ وَعَجَبَهُمْ. He despised all of them except إِلَّا بَقَايَا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ, except for a small portion of the people of the book. Everyone else, Allah Azza wa Jal looked at them and He despised them in that they had all, majority of mankind had left what the messengers had brought. Okay, this was a very, very dark period. Okay, because from Isa alayhi salam till Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, there are no messengers. There are no messengers. There are no prophets. All of these years. Okay, there are some reports that a couple of prophets came right after Isa, 3 of them, but those reports are all weak. So the correct report that we have is the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam saying, La nabiyya bayni wa baynahu. There's no prophet between me and Isa alayhi salam. So this is the phase that humanity is living through. There is no guidance. There is no direct connection to the divine. So darkness is, of course, arising. Then we have a third religion, which was Zoroastrianism. Okay, al-Majus, al-Majusiyya. Now, this particular group or this particular religion was founded on worshipping nature, different aspects of nature. So they would worship the fire, they would worship the sun 4 times a day. It was obligatory upon them and necessary for them to worship the sun. They would worship the moon as well, and they would worship both fire and water as well. Okay? So this is a religion which is basically worshiping nature. And of course, it's devoid at the same time, simultaneously, it happens to be devoid of spirituality, in that all of their religiosity is within their temples. Outside of it, the practice is not there. Okay? So this is another problem within Zoroastrianism, in addition to the fact that they're worshiping not God, but they're worshiping creation, the creation of God. Okay? Then we have Buddhism. Okay? That's another religion which existed and continues to exist in Central Asia and India and so on and so forth, right? And Buddhism was a religion that, to simplify things, they essentially had denied God. Then they had taken Buddha himself as God. And then they added to that different gods in addition to Buddha as well. So as you can see, every single one of these religions are religions which have one aspect or another of shirk within them. Okay? And what do all of the messengers call to? The first thing that they call to is to correct the shirk that the people may have went into, to correct the polytheism that people may have went into. Then in addition to that, last but not least, we have the Hindus. Hindus are largely remain till today, and they were, and they continue to be within India. Okay, in the 6th century, Hinduism had over 330 million gods that they were worshiping. 330 million gods, because of the fact that every single thing that would be amazing, that would cause amazement to them, every single thing that would cause fear to them, every single thing that would benefit them in any way would become for them an idol that they would worship other than Allah Rabbul Izzati wal Jalal. Okay? And this continues till today. So because of that, the compilation of all of these things that are amazing and that are surprising, that are helpful and beneficial and that are harmful, all of these things, of course, could become countless. So that's why by that time in the 6th century, the year in which the century in which the Prophet ﷺ was born, they were worshipping 330 million different idols, okay? Or 330 million different gods, let's put it that way. Okay, this is in India. And any other place where Hinduism had existed, right? Now we come to Arabia. Just as all of these other places, there are aspects of polytheism, there are aspects of shirk, there are aspects of people worshipping other than Allah Rabbul Izzati wal Jalal. Also in Arabia, there is that. But there's a distinction, and I'll speak about that bi'idhnillahi ta'ala very soon as well. Because one may say that all of these places, they have people who are worshipping other than Allah Azza wa Jal. Why Arabia of all places gets selected by Allah Azza wa Jal to send the Messenger Muḥammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So I'll answer that inshaAllah ta'ala in a coming segment right now, today bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Okay? Now, the Arabian society has remains of what I like to call the Abrahamic monotheism. Okay? Al-Hanifiyya. The Abrahamic monotheism. And what that means is the idea of worshipping Allah Rabbul Izzati wal Jalal alone, that was introduced by all messengers, but Ibrahim alayhi salam really came to be known by this even more so than other messengers for reasons which we can mention at other time. But all messengers call to this, right? Worshipping Allah Azza wa Jal alone and not worshipping anyone other than Allah Azza wa Jal. So remains of this religion still remained within Arabia, what they call Al-Hanifiyya, okay? And of course, there was a few people when the Prophet ﷺ had been sent and when he was born, who were still worshipping based on whatever they knew of the Abrahamic faith. Okay? One of them was a man by the name of Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl. He was one of the only remaining people within Arabia that was worshipping still based on the Abrahamic creed and the Abrahamic theology and belief. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ said about this man that on the day of judgment, he will be sent as an ummah all by himself. Right? يُبْعَثُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أُمَّةً وَحْدَهُ. He will be sent on the day of judgment as an ummah all by himself. So this man was a very, very serious man in that all of Arabia is worshipping other than Allah Azza wa Jal, and he realizes that his mind tells him this doesn't make sense. Why should I be worshipping dates that I eat anyways? Why should I be worshipping animals and rocks and pebbles that I create, meaning I put together myself? I should be worshipping the one who created all these, and hence he decided to stick to the Ibrahimi creed, or the Abrahamic creed, right? Al-Hanifiyya, Al-Ibrahimiyya, right? So this was there, just the remains of it. However, Arabians generally knew about Ismail alayhi salam, and they generally knew about Ibrahim alayhi salam. Why? Because Quraysh, in reality, in essence, are descendants of Ismail alayhi salam, right? Because we know, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a subsequent lesson, we know that Ismail alayhi salam came, Ibrahim alayhi salam brought Hajar and they settled down in where? In Mecca. And then the tribe of Jurhum, when they came, cutting the long story short, Ismail alayhi salam married into this tribe, and that's where the Arabians in Mecca came from, right? They're known as the Adnaniyun. And the Yemenis and wherever else they settled are known as the Qahtaniyun, right? So that's where they came from. They came from the progeny of Ismail alayhi salam. This means that Ismail was known to them. This means that Ibrahim alayhi salam was known to them. So much so that inside of the Kaaba, the Arabians of that time, who were not Muslim, they had placed a picture or a statue of Ibrahim and Ismail as they were drawing what they called al-azlam. Azlam are basically arrows that you put in a bag or a bucket or something, and one of them says amarani rabbi, the other one says nahani rabbi, and the third one is empty. Okay, it's a way that they used to make decisions, early Arabians. One of them says, one of the arrows inside of this bag says that my Lord has given me a command. The other one says, my Lord has told me not to do this. The other one says, nothing, is just empty. Okay? So if they may want to make a decision, they'll go to this bag and they'll draw these sticks, these arrows. If it says, Amarani Rabbi, my Lord has commanded me, then they'll go forth with whatever they were trying to do. Okay? And if it says, Nahani Rabbi, that my Lord has told me not to do this, then they will not do it. And if it doesn't say anything, if it's the third one which is empty, then they will try it again. Okay, this is how they would make decisions. Now, of course, we have a better way of making decision, which is known as istikhara, right? Which is known as istikhara. We literally invoke Allah Azza wa Jal, ask Him to help us make our decisions, right? This is how the Arabians would make decisions. Why am I saying this? Because inside of the Kaaba, Ibrahim and Ismail were placed by the Arabians as statues as they are drawing these arrows from the bag. So when the Prophet entered into the Kaaba, or right before he entered into the Kaaba, he said, قَاتَلَهُمُ May Allah go to war with them. By Allah, they knew that لَقَدْ عَلِمُوا مَسْتَقْسَمَا بِالْأَزْلَامِ. By Allah, they knew that Ibrahim and Ismail had never drawn these arrows ever. They knew that, but they still made these statues. And then, of course, the knowledge of the fact that Ibrahim and Ismail didn't do such things. They didn't invoke arrows instead of Allah Azza wa Jal, right? That knowledge slowly, within the next generation and the generation after, it decreased. And so people actually, some people, not everyone, started to think that this is how Ibrahim and Ismail were as well. So now we don't really have a clear understanding of the Abrahamic creed anymore in Arabia, except by a handful of people. Okay? Except by a handful of people. Because of this, slowly but surely, polytheism begins to spread within Arabia. So for instance, within the Kaaba, I gave you two statues that were there. They had placed 360 different statues within the Kaaba. And they started to worship anything that they could find and they could get their hands on. They would worship rocks. They would believe that angels happen to be gods as well. They would take jinns as gods. They would take stars as gods as well. And they would also believe the angels happen to be the daughters of Allah Rabbul Izzati wal Jalal. They believed that jinns are actually partners with Allah Azza wa Jal, and so they began to worship all of these different things. Okay? This is a little bit about the different religions that were there prior to the advent of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now let's take a look at all of the different societies, major societies, prior to the birth of Rasulullah, or around the time, the same century in which the Prophet ﷺ was born. Okay? We have, first and foremost, we have the Eastern Roman Empire. Okay? The Eastern Roman Empire was an empire that was falling because of this, because of the fact that slowly but surely the emperors had increased the taxation on their society, okay? One tax after another, so much so that the people could no longer bear it anymore. And Ibn Khaldun, who happens to be a very important sociologist, he concluded, Ibn Khaldun, by the way, he's a Muslim sociologist and he's one of the most important sociologists in the history of the science of sociology, okay? And he says, around the 9th century, he says that taxation, increase in taxation, is one of the signs that that society is not going to remain for very long. Because if there was economic strength within society, there would be no need for taxation. So this particular society, the Roman, Eastern Roman society, is now being taxed so much so that they wish for any other people to come and rule them, except the people who happen to be the emperors of that time. This is one of the problems here. In addition to that, we have another problem in this society, and that is there's a duality taking place within society, okay? You have every single person within society talking about religion. Okay? But whilst people are talking about religion, simultaneously, you have those same people engaging in every single thing that happens to be irreligious. Okay? So you have a severe duality within this society. So much so that they enjoy things, their recreation happens to be things which are completely unethical. Okay? So one of the ways they enjoy themselves is they gather together in large stadiums and they watch people fight to death with other people, or they watch people fight to death with predatory animals. Okay? So now you have people cheering other people on inside of a large stadium, inside of a theater, and what are they doing? They're just fighting to death. They're watching someone else kill an individual before their own eyes. This is how they enjoy themselves. So you have a duality. People are generally speaking about religion, and they're talking about, they're talking about the intricacies of the Byzantine religion at that time, and simultaneously they're doing these unethical things, the same people. In addition to that, we have a second society, second empire, which is the Sassanid Empire. Okay, that's the Iranian, basically, empire. Now, when we hear the word Iran, we're probably thinking of the country Iran, but no, we're talking about the historic Sassanid Empire that is much larger than what we see today. Okay, so this empire is very large as well. But you have many, many problems within this empire as well. You have people there happens to be a lot of unemployment. There happens to be a society in which people generally do not care, generally have become filthy in their interactions with one another. So much so that you may have people walk into someone's house and break-ins became very common. Walk into someone's house, steal all of their furniture, steal their wealth, steal their women as well. Women became objectified, so steal the women as well, and so forth. And this is another problem. You have people looking at their emperors as gods. Okay? So literally, the Sassanid emperor is, the Sassani emperor is called God by their people. Okay? It doesn't matter who he happens to be or who she happens to be. He is God according to these people. Now, of course, the Sassaniyun, they ruled between 224 after the assumed death or common era until 651. So until about a little bit less than 100 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, their kingdom came to an end during the time of Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Okay? So this is some of the things that are happening. In addition to that, an example of how lavishly the emperors of the Sassaniyun were living is the following example. When Yazdajerd, who was the ruling person when Umar ibn Khattab had waged his war against the Persia, okay, he fled, fleeing away from the Muslim armies. And when he fled, listen to this very carefully, sisters, hang in there, hang in there. You're done? Because I can stop and then you can continue. Okay, great. So when Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu had waged his war against the Sassaniyun, Yazdajerd, who happened to be the emperor of that time, he fled. He fled, and when he was fleeing, he brought along with him the following things. Okay? This should just give you an idea of how lavishly they were living. Okay? He brought along with him 1,000 cooks. 1,000 cooks. He brought along with him 1,000 cooks. He brought along with him 1,000 singers. He brought along with him 1,000 caretakers for his leopards, which were his pets. Okay? He brought along with him 1,000 also 1,000 eagles as well. 1,000 caretakers for his eagles. Now, if you have 1,000 people to look after your leopards and eagles, 1,000 each, you can just think about how many leopards and eagles this person would have had. Even that, then he actually felt like he was wronged. He felt like, you know what, I've lost so much of my kingdom. This is what he is fleeing away from his city, Al-Madain, with 1,000 cooks, 1,000 singers, 1,000 caretakers for his leopards, 1,000 caretakers for his eagles, and so forth, right? This is what he's fleeing away with. Just imagine for a second what his kingdom would have actually been like. Then we come to the next one, which happens to be India. India is also a place in which a lot of unusual things are happening, okay? Before we get to the unusual things, think about early India. India was a place in which the mathematical sciences had flourished. India was a place in which astronomy had flourished. It's a very, very important society, and it's contributed a lot to the world. And India was a place within which medicine had flourished. India is also a place within which philosophy had flourished. This is all things happening prior to the 6th century, prior to the time in which the Prophet ﷺ was born, right? But within that century, what happened? Within that century, historians are in agreement that this was the lowest point for India in the history of India, the 6th century. The lowest point from economy, the lowest point from every single angle, from their culture, from akhlaq, from manners, from adab, from every single angle. This happens to be the lowest point in the history of humanity, in the history of Indian recorded history. Okay, so much so that within the temples in India, it's recorded that at this point, nudity was something that would take place not outside in public places, not behind closed doors, or in certain corridors, in certain places, in red light districts and so forth. We're talking about within the temples, you have all sorts of obscenities taking place, all sorts of fahish things happening, right? Within temples. And why? Because it also became part of the religious rites and rituals. Sexuality became part of religion as well. Now, okay, in addition to that, women had no value within the society. In this society, by the way, this seems to be a common thread within every society that we've discussed, the devaluation of women, and Islam brings value to women in the 7th century where no other society is giving value to women. Let me give you some examples of what's happening in India to women. Okay, in India during the 6th century, you have a man who believes his woman is his property. He owns this woman. So when he gets into the 6th century casino, he includes his woman as one of the things that he'll be gambling on. Okay, so you would have people gambling on their women and also their children as well. The woman, after her husband would die, did not have the opportunity, did not have the choice to get married again. Okay, so much so that women felt so oppressed that they would go and burn themselves. This became a common practice in 6th century India, and it continued for quite some time within certain religions and certain sectors. Women would just burn themselves alive, and this was especially known to be a practice in the higher sector of the society. Okay, so the higher you are, the more chances that the woman, once her husband dies, she'll just burn herself alive, and then those ashes will be disposed of. Okay, this particular practice of burning oneself alive, it continued to remain all the way till the time in which India was colonized by the British. Okay, so in some places in India, this practice remained as well. Of course, there was a Muslim influence as well, and the Muslims didn't believe in this practice, but in some places in India, this practice of burning yourself alive when your husband dies, especially if you happen to be a noble woman from the aristocracy of society, that remained till the British, had colonized India. Okay, this is a little bit about what's happening in India. Okay, there's another thing about India, and that is that at this point, even though India happened to be a very strong participant in culture around the world, prior to and afterwards, at this point, they are pretty much completely disconnected from the global scene. Okay? They're very, very disconnected from the global scene. Their literature happens to be very weak during this time. The architectural advancement happened to be very weak as well. Architectural design happens to be almost not even there. All of these signs of backwardness within India are clear. Europe. Now, when we come to Europe, we find a place in which ignorance and illiteracy is the mark of the society. Completely ignorant and completely illiterate. Bloodshed is a day-to-day matter within the society. We have people who don't have any care of hygiene. Okay? People would smell really awful and they would look really awful, and this wouldn't be a problem because this is how people in Europe at that time would live. And you have a society which is not connected to any part of the world, and no other part of the world is connected to it from a civilization perspective. This society is still searching. Remember what we said about women? Backwardness in terms of the way women were treated. So this society is still discussing within their intellectual elites whether women are human beings or whether women are animals. This is a discussion that has taken place in 6th century Arabia, whether women happen to be animals and whether women happen to be human beings. They're still discussing whether women actually have souls or not. They're still discussing whether women have the right to own something, okay? They're still discussing whether women can actually transact, meaning buy and sell, and these are still questions that the intellectual elite of 6th century European society are discussing. So, by the way, before I move on from this point, it's very important to note over here, anything that you see in terms of the rights that Islam had provided for women during 6th and 7th century, if anyone points out something wrong with those rights, right, within the modern framework, then you have to remind them, this is what we were up against. We were given all of these rights at a time where people are still discussing in Europe whether women happen to have souls or not, whether women, are animals or they're human beings, and whether women can buy and sell, whether they can own, and all of these things. Okay, so you have to put things into perspective, and then things start to look better. And they look more understandable. Okay. Now we come to the fifth, and perhaps the most important society for the purposes of our lectures, inshallah. The fifth society happens to be the Arabian society. Okay, Arabian Peninsula itself. Arabian Peninsula, by the way, is no better. All of the evils that I'm telling you, all of them or many of them happen to be there within the Arabian society as well. If they were better, then the Prophet wouldn't have to be sent, right? But why Arabia of all other places? That's an answer I'll get to, inshallah, today, hopefully. Okay, so in this society, you have people who are involved with drugs. You have people who are involved with You have people who are involved with drugs. You have people who are involved with alcohol. We have people who are just overall evil people. Bloodshed is also a mark of this society as well. Highway robberies, whatever highways meant within that time and that context, were also very, very common as well. You have also a problem with how women are treated within the Arabian 6th century society as well. Why? Because the Arabs believed women are objects at that time, okay? They believed that women are objects, so they are also inherited, they are bought, they're purchased, they're sold, and so on and so forth. There are foods which women are allowed to eat, and there are many foods which only women and men are allowed to eat, and there are other foods only men are allowed to eat, according to this Arabian society at that time. Okay? Men are allowed to get married to any women, and however many numbers, there's no numbers attached to it. All of these things are there within the Arabian society. Wars are so common that people do them as a hobby, okay? If they can't find anyone to fight with, they'll fight with family members. And that's why an Arabian poet says, وَأَحْيَانًا عَلَى بَكْرٍ أَخِينَا. Sometimes we go and fight with Bakr, who happens to be our relative. إِذَا مَا لَمْ نَجِدْ إِلَّا أَخَانَا. When we find no one except for our brother to fight, we'll fight him. Because this is something we have to do. It's part of our culture. We need to go to wars, otherwise they feel restless. This is the Arabian society that we're dealing with. Alcohol became very, very prevalent. And by the way, I personally, in my reads of early Arabian literature, I noticed that some of the habits that are there within early Arabs, what I mean by early Arabs is prior to the advent of the message of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I find them also within thug life of today as well. Okay, so sometimes one can say that the evils, because it's shaitan that is trying to whisper to people to do evil things, right? So shaitan is there at that time and he's there at this time as well. So in some capacities, you'll find similar things, so much so, you'll find similar words as well, okay? I'll give you an example. Right now, when you have a person who is a drug dealer, what do they call this drug dealer? A lot of people, just as a short form, will simply say dealer, okay? Within certain circles, they'll just say he's a dealer. And what they mean by that is he's a drug dealer, right? And you're supposed to understand from the type of person you're speaking to, from the context that you're in, and so forth. Arabians were no different, because they would use the word tajir to refer to someone who would sell alcohol, even though the word tajir simply means a merchant. Okay? So they would use the word tijara as synonymous to sell it in some contexts, as synonymous to selling drugs, just as some thugs today will use the word dealer as synonymous to dealing drugs or selling drugs, right? So that's one of the marks of the society as well, that alcoholic sales or alcohol sales are very high. People buy and sell this particular intoxicant a lot. And another thing that we see is riba. Riba is very prevalent within the society, okay? Usury is so prevalent that it's even, if you look at the type of usurious transactions that they had at that time, they are so severe that one cannot even imagine them even in our times, with the riba being as ribawi as we see it today, okay? So nowadays you have 2%, 3%, 7%, 10%, okay? In the Arabian society, you had a time to give your money back to the creditor. Okay, someone gave you money, he's a creditor, you're the debtor, you're the one that's taking the debt. When it comes time for you to pay your debt back, you have to pay back. If you don't pay back, what happens? Well, nowadays we have what, 5, 10, 15% maximum, something like that, right? They would double it up. Every time you default, if it was 100 dirhams, it would become 200. If it was, and compounded. If it became 200, the next time you default again, it would become 300 and so forth. So riba was just so severe that it would, of course, cause very, very severe economic harm to people that got themselves into loans as well. Okay, zina or fornication and adultery became quite prevalent as well, especially within certain sectors of society. We know that within early Arabian society, there happened to be slavery. Within slaves, zina was very prevalent. In fact, some slave masters would use their slaves as sex slaves, meaning they would take these slaves and they would sell them off to people for prostitution. Okay, so this was something that was quite prevalent within pre-Islamic Arabian society. Another thing that we see is that women's rights are next to nothing within the society. So much so that her money can be taken at any point. So much so that her rights, she can be stripped of all of her rights at any point. So much so that she would normally not get any of her inheritance. So much so that after she would go through a talaq or a divorce, the previous husband and the family members would force this woman not to remarry again, which is known as al-adl. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade us from this in the Quran very explicitly. So much so that women would be inherited like you inherit anything. If someone dies, you inherit money. Women were considered an object during this time. And as I showed to you, this was happening in not just Arabia, it's happening in India, it's happening in many other places. So women's rights are next to nothing within this time, okay? And another thing that we see is what we call wa'dul banat. This was a very, very severely dangerous and sad practice that was there within the Arabian society. And in every single tribe in Arabia, we find this practice. So it wasn't known to be a practice of one specific tribe. All tribes of Arabia are practicing this. What's that? They would take the daughter and literally bury this daughter alive. Why? Because the daughter would not bring an income. The daughter might bring some sort of shame to the household. The daughter might bring this is a very sad practice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke of this in the Quran as well, right? That إِذِ الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. On that day when the maw'uda will be asked, the young girl will be asked, who was placed within a grave while she was still alive, why were you killed, O young one? Why were you killed? But this is what they would do. They would take this young girl, not just girl, young baby, female baby, right? And they would just bury it without any shame, without any feelings, they just wouldn't feel it, right? And we have some reports of some of the companions telling us that they actually did this before they accepted Islam. Now, of course, after Islam, they felt guilty for what they had done. But this was something that was a practice within that society. It was taking place in every single tribe, and it would be so ritualistic. Imagine this, that if the father was traveling and he was out on vacation or on business or something, they wouldn't bury the daughter until the father gets back, even if she's grown old. So now they would bury a child who is old enough to see what is happening to it. This is something that is recorded. But this is what was happening and of course it's in the Quran as well, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this maw'uda, this young girl that was buried alive, she will be asked, why were you killed? What happened to you? What did you do to deserve this particular form of death, right? Allahumma musta'an. And another thing that we see is that people would generally kill their children out of fear that they would not have enough money to take care of the child. Okay, so if they had a child, they thought that they're not wealthy enough to take care of this child, male or female, indiscriminately they would kill the child. Now, of course, the rich ones would do it to some of the females. They would keep other females for reproduction, right? But they would not keep some of the females. They would rid themselves of them. Allahumma musta'an. And another practice that we see is some people would just vow to God that if such and such happens, I will slaughter my child. They thought the child is their property, like an animal or something like that. So oh God, if you do such and such for me, I will slaughter my child. Okay? This was a practice that was there within the pagan Arabian society, the pre-Islamic Arabian society. And one of the reasons why they would kill the daughters most specifically is because they had this idea. Remember earlier on when I was talking about their creed, they had this idea that daughters are actually, the females are actually the daughters of Allah Azza wa Jalla, right? Okay, the angels are the daughters of Allah Azza wa Jalla, right? So they would say, well then females should also go to Allah Azza wa Jal, so just give them back to Allah. That's how, this is the type of idea that some of them actually had. Allahul Musta'an, this is what's happening within this era. What we can say is that humanity at large is going through very, very severe darkness. Why did Allah Azza wa Jal pick Arabia of all places to give this message? Why not somewhere else? Okay? Why wasn't the Prophet ﷺ sent here in Malaysia? Why wasn't the Prophet ﷺ sent in Central Asia, in India, in other empires that I spoke of? Why wasn't the Prophet ﷺ sent in any of these other societies? We know that Allah sent prophets to all nations. وَإِن مِّنْ أُمَّةٍ إِلَّا خَلَا فِيهَا نَذِيرٌ. There is not a nation except that there was a prophet that was sent to them. This is something Allah says quite clearly in the Quran. Why wasn't Muḥammad ﷺ sent to some other people, even though we notice that at this time every society needs guidance, right? Firstly, because of the fact that the sickness of shirk, of polytheism, was rather new within Arabia, okay? So there's still greater hope of stopping these people and, let's put it this way, nipping it in the bud, okay? It was still a rather new practice that was introduced in Arabia, because remember, they knew, based on their forefathers, the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam, okay? They knew about that. So it was a rather new practice. Polytheism, paganism was new to this society, and because of this, there's still chances that this society will be easier to handle, and then the message can go out to other societies as well, okay? The second thing is, and perhaps this is one of the most important things, wallahu a'lam, is that the pagan Arabian society, though they were in the pre-Islamic times, they were pagans, they were polytheists, though all those things are true, but they were a people of truth nonetheless, okay? They were a people of trust to some degree. They were a people of bravery to some degree as well. They were a people that were generally not hypocritical, okay? They were a people who were generally not hypocritical. And you will find that they fight complete wars because someone has touched them the wrong way in terms of their honor. So honor is something very, very important to this society, but they've lost track of how to deal with this honor, right? But honor is something really, really important to this society. It's a rather new nation, okay? Meaning it's an up and coming nation that needs a leader, and that is willing to go in a direction if the right leader comes and rules this particular society, okay? You have a society where, though yes, there's no equality between men and women, though yes, there is a lot of oppression that takes place, you still have the meaning of equality there to some degree. Not between the genders, but between people. How so? I'm going to give you an example which perhaps you can't even imagine in our times, okay? A man was approached by a man from Banu Tamim, a Tamimi man, was approached by one of the kings of Arabia, And he said to him that, I want this particular horse from you. He had a horse, he wanted to get this horse from him. The horse was named Scab. He wanted this horse. Now, this man loved his horse. So he looked at, who is he speaking to now? He's speaking to a king from the kings of Arabia. Okay? He looked at this person and he said, you want this Scab? And he said to him, أبيت اللعنة إن سكاب علق نفيس لا تعار ولا تباع مفدات مكرمة علينا يجاع لها العيال ولا تجاع. That أبيت اللعنة. This is a way that the Arabs would greet one another. Now you can see the frankness in this type of greeting, okay? In this way, normally if you today were to go and speak to a king or an emperor, you would likely be behind bars, okay? likely you would be behind bars. Even though it's not, he didn't say something wrong, he was just frank in his conversation, okay? Now, unless you're dealing with a just king, then of course you wouldn't have this. But in Arabia, they didn't have, at this time, now maybe things may have changed, but I'm saying at this time in 6th century Arabia, they didn't have a very severe classism in this way. There was classism, but a very severe classism wasn't there. So this person is addressing a king. He says, Abayt al-la'n, which means, may you avoid doing something that causes you to have curse upon you. Is that a nice thing to say? Doesn't sound like a nice thing to say, but this is how they would speak to one another. And what they really mean by this is actually something good, right? They mean by that, may you avoid doing anything evil, right? May you avoid doing anything evil. So it sounds like something you wouldn't say, but this is how the Arabians would speak. And here he is speaking to a king from amongst the kings of Arabia, and he says to him, Abayt al-la'n, right? May you avoid doing something that may lead you to having the curse upon you. Inna sakaba ilqun. Sakab happens to be my wealth. Nafisun la tu'aru wa la tuba'u. He's very valuable to me. Sakab, his horse, is very valuable to me. I'm not going to sell it, and I'm not going to trade it as well. I'm not going to lend it out to you. Mufaddatun mukarramatun alayna. I will give myself ransom for Sakab, and it is very, very valuable to me. Yuja'u laha al-'iyalu wa la tuja'u. I will keep my children hungry so it can eat, but it will never go hungry. This is how much he loves his horse. And the king that's asking him, can I just, maybe this horse I like, I want to take it, right? This is the answer he gives to him. He doesn't get killed for it. He doesn't get anything for it. Why? Because, as I said, classism is not there as much, okay? This is very important. Because of this, because of the lack of classism, it's a society which can perhaps be led in the right direction. This is one of the things that distinguishes the Arabian society from the pre-Islamic Arabian society from some of the other societies that were there at that time. Another example of this is Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah. Okay, Rustum had invited a delegation of the Muslims to speak about what? To speak about Islam, to give him knowledge about Islam. Now this guy is going to a completely different empire. He's going to a place in which people are not used to dealing with kings and emperors and sultans in a very frank way. Arabia is that way, okay? So he goes to a place where all of this is very different than Arabia, and he walks up to the emperor, and he sits on the chair right next to him. And the emperor didn't do anything. He just looked at him, unusual thing to do. But all of the people there, they started to look at Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, and they got up and they tried to hurt him, and they tried to get him off of the chair, and so on and so forth. So he was amazed. And he said to them, I used to get all of these stories about you and hear all of these stories about you, and I now know that there is not a nation which is more stupider than your nation. This is what he's saying. Okay? We in the Arab world, inna ma'shar al-Arab, us in Arabia, we happen to be equal. That's what he says. لا يستعبد بعضنا بعضا. Some of us don't make other people into slaves of those others as well. Except if that other person happens to be my enemy, then it is made into a slave. That's what Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah is saying. Okay? Sahabi. And then he says, إِلَّا أَن يَكُونَ مُحَارِبًا. I thought that you used to treat people with the same type of mercy that we treat our people with as well. But you should have told me before I came here that all of this is in fact not true, and some of you happen to be gods for the others. That's what he said. Right? So you can see he's shocked at what he's seeing as well, because they're not used to, they're nomadic people, they're not used to all of these different rites and rituals and so on and so forth, right? They're not used to these things. So then he continues and he says that I didn't just come on my own accord. You are the one who invited me. So as a person who's been invited, I must also be treated as a guest as well, on top of that. So he's looking to get all of the rights of a guest in a society where they're thinking the emperor is in fact God, or something similar to that, and above question, and so on and so forth. So this made Arabia a very different place. Another thing that made Arabia a very different place, and this is perhaps what I'll leave you off with, inshallah, is the fact that in Arabia happened to be the Kaaba, the house of Allah Azza wa Jal, which was the first house of Allah Azza wa Jal, or the first place of worship, as Allah tells us in the Quran, إِنَّ أَوَّلَ بَيْتٍ وُضِعَ لِلنَّاسِ لَلَّذِي بِبَكَّةَ مُبَارَكًا وَهُدًى لِلْعَالَمِينَ. The first house that had been placed for people to worship in happens to be the one in Bakka, or Mecca. Bakka is the historic word for Mecca. And the word Bakka is actually also in the Bible as well. Okay? The word Bakka is also within the Bible as well. Bakka and Mecca basically are the same thing. Allah uses the word Bakka for Mecca in the Quran as well. So the first house that was placed for worship for mankind is the one that happens to be Bakka, Mubarakan wa hudan lil alamin. It is blessed and it is a guidance for all of mankind. Inshallah, we'll speak more about these different topics in our subsequent lectures. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Today, as I said, what we were trying to do, and alhamdulillah, I think we have successfully done that, was two main things. We wanted to look at all of the religions prior to Islam. Not all, the main religions, okay? And the main empires and dynasties that were there during the time of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, during that same centuries. And why is it that Allah Azza wa Jal chose of all people, of all places, Mecca and Arabia for the Prophet ﷺ to be sent, okay? Now, what's one last point, and it's very important, that the Prophet had exceptional leadership skills. That is what led to, after the will of Allah Azza wa Jal, the people of Arabia being saved at the hands of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because we know that some of the Orientalists, they say, in fact, the Arabian society was looking in this direction already, and all of the circumstances were right for the legacy of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to be as it was. They say this. But we say in response to this, this is partially true, but not entirely so, because for 500 years, Christianity had been trying to infiltrate Arabia and they were not successful. Okay? For over 500 years, Christianity had been trying to infiltrate Arabia and they were not able to. So within 23 years, the Prophet ﷺ comes and he brings a message which is currently not known to most people in the world, as you notice, because most people are worshipping other than Allah, except for a handful of people around the world. And people answered that call, and people flocked to the Messenger ﷺ within 20 odd years. That is, in fact, great leadership skills as well on the part of the finality of the messengers. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the tawfiq to continue to practice, to convey, to understand, and to implement within our lives. Jazakumullahu khairan for patiently listening. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.